Hello and welcome to this month's IriusRisk Community Edition Ask Me Anything. May the 4th be with you today, and thanks for joining us for this question and answer session. We have made a couple of improvements already versus last month, so we have extended the time. If we need it, we can take up to 45 minutes to answer your queries. We already have some to run through. I am Claire Allenaddy, Global Product Marketing Manager here, and with me is James Rabe, our Senior Solution Architect, and he's also a subject matter expert in our IriusRisk platform, so you're in very capable hands as usual. Hi James, thanks for joining.
Hey,
And
thanks.
if something does spring to mind that you would like to ask, then you can do so via the chat box, which I'll be monitoring. But otherwise, we'll work through the questions that we've got. And James, I'll hand over to you to start with a short demo of our product. And if there's anything else you wanted to start with.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire. So for those who may be unfamiliar with Community Edition, we usually start these AMA sessions by just doing a quick, few minute overview of how the platform works. So first thing you'll see when you come in is you'll see you've got your all project screen where you can see I've got a project that I've been working with here. A nice fun name here, testing 5555. If I open that up, I'll actually be able to, first it's going to take me directly into my diagramming interface. And you can see we were playing with this in our last session. But if I go ahead and open up that diagram, I have the ability to deconstruct my application, rebuild my infrastructure, and just go through the process of describing visually what I'm working on today. So whether or not that's going to be public facing side of an app, and you can see I've gone through and I've edited this, and we can remove items. We can go through and we can add additional trust zones. We have the ability to scroll through our list of different components, and I can add items to my diagram. I can then begin to draw data flows between those two items, right? I can add labels to those. Move my cup out of the way here. So you can edit data flows, and then I can go through and add, see if I click that. Yep, there we go. I can go through and I can add either predefined data flows, or if I want to create a data flow in here, I can. So I could say, HTTPS, for example, right? I can say what kind of asset is being passed between two different points, which then visually displays that on my diagram. If I had it checked on there. So data flow tags, data flow assets, right? Visually displaying that information. And again, just contextually describing, what I'm working on here, right? So whether it's a part of an application or it's an entire app, just the ability to diagram that. And then I can update my threat model, which is going through and looking at all of the details I provided here, both on my diagram with questions, with tags. And it's going through and grabbing data from the library, and it's importing certain types of threats, certain types of countermeasures, and then it's going to bring all of that into my threat model, which we'll look at here in just a second once it finishes updating. Give that just a second. I'll go ahead and click over. So, and then now I've got all of my different components on here. And if I just go ahead and open these up, we may see a couple show up here as it finishes updating. There we go. So now I've got all of my different components, all of my different use cases and threats with current risk response, my countermeasure progress. And you can see as we go through here, this one doesn't have, a ton on here because we did some work last time to mark some of these as out of scope. But if I open up one of these threats and we just take a look at what the structure is, we've got our threat, we've got our impacts to confidentiality, integrity, and availability for any assets that are assigned on this particular component. So this would kind of be interpreted as, if I have a threat, what is that threat going to do? Does it attack the availability of some underlying asset? I've got my weakness, which allows my threat to be exploited, and then I've got my countermeasure or control, which is going to close my weakness and reduce my threat. Okay, so my threats interface lets me view my threat data, my weakness, my countermeasure. And then if I go onto my countermeasure interface, this one has a similar view, but now it's only going to view the countermeasures. So it's going to focus on the, what are we going to do? What can we do? Part of our threat modeling process. And now it's going to be focusing specifically on just the countermeasures and not the threats. And that's really, a big kind of a broad overview of the larger items as a part of our threat modeling process. So I think with that clear, maybe we want to start into questions if we
Thank you.
have.
Yeah, we've had one through. We've had two actually. So let me just open this up here. So thanks, Sumit, for providing this to us. So they've said, no doubt IriusRisk is an awesome tool covering tons of things for threat modeling. I just want to know, out of curiosity, are there a number of attacks taken into consideration for infrastructure? But what James says on end-to-end implementation for application that covers the web application threats too. Quite a long question. I'm hoping you've got visibility in your screen, James, in case you need
Yeah,
to
I'm looking at
reread
that.
that.
I just want to know, out of curiosity, there are a number of attacks taken into consideration for infrastructure, but what James said on end-to-end implementation model for applications that covers the web and application security. Yeah, so great question. So when we talk about, right, so secure design, architectural risk analysis, we do have libraries that contain threats for both, think like OWASP top 10, so more application API application security, but we also have components in here. And let me see if I can go grab a couple, just show you. We also contain components in here related to infrastructure, generic components. So like if I go into, so we've got some in here like antivirus, we've got some in here around, actually probably just easier to do search bar here. So like we've got firewall components in here. So yeah, so items that are, it's because it's slightly better than me having to scroll through. We've got something like 600 components, so it takes a little while to scroll through them all. But we definitely have things related to infrastructure security, IoT, industrial control systems. And there's a bit of a jump when we move to the enterprise edition where we start adding on things like an IEC library that focuses specifically on IEC 62443 components and things like that. So there is a bit of a jump once we move into the enterprise edition where we have some additional libraries available. Hopefully that answers your question. Apologies if we misunderstood it, but I think that's what you're asking.
Thank you. Yeah, please, if that didn't answer, then send us a subsequent message and we'll take a look. And then there's another one here. And following up for the threat libraries too, how can we make sure that libraries are updated with the new threats?
Yeah, perfect. So, and I'll answer this question in view of, let's talk about what we do in community, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about like the enterprise side a little bit. So when we update our security content library, so all of the content and components, with the exception of the IUC library, we make all of that available in the community edition for free. So anytime IriusRisk goes month to month, if we update something with the AWS library, all of the new threats, all of the new countermeasures are also included in community. So don't feel like, okay, this is just 2020's content. This is going to be on par with the content that we're also deploying inside of enterprise. Now, the jump from community to enterprise, that allows you, the user, the enterprise user, to actually go and you can forklift your own content into your own custom library. Because you see, and I know, if you're not an enterprise user, you don't see this, but I have the ability to manage templates. If I were an enterprise user, I would have, custom libraries up here as well. I could manage trust zones. And in those instances, if I've gone through and let's say I've threat modeled an API and I've got new specific threats that anytime in the future, when I use the API component, I want to make sure that I include all of those manual threats. I can actually take those and put those into my library. So in the future, whenever I apply that API component, it's going to automatically have those threats and countermeasures included by default. So I'm not having to go through and redo that work. Every single time I generate a threat model, I look through my list, and I'll show you what this would look like. I look through my list and I look for all of my threats or countermeasures that were generated manually. I don't know if we're going to have any on this. I don't recall if we generated any manual threats in May. But I can go over and you see I've got this source column. I can see this was created by a rules engine. Let's say if I'm a user, I went through and I said, hey, I want to add a threat to this. I'm going to say it's a component use case. I'm going to pick my component that's in my item. So maybe let's use the Salesforce icon. I'm going to say these are, I already have one on there. Authentication based threats. some manual threats, manual threat, right? And I can add that threat to my threat model, right? Same thing I'm going to do if I'm whiteboarding with somebody and we're going through and we're creating threats, right? Now, the difference here is instead of now I have to have that person in the room with me the next time that I'm threat modeling, I can actually take this manual threat and I can move that up into my library. So that the next time I drop, Salesforce onto my diagram, right, to show some third-party integration, now it's going to automatically have those threats attached to it. That way I don't have to worry about, do I have the right people in the room? Do I have the right experts? It's just automatically going to start bringing in, those people automatically, or excuse me, those threats automatically. So hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to reply back and we'll take another swing at it.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to head over to the submitted list that we got through on our Google form. Perfect. So I've got here, what does the apply standard features, what does the apply standards feature do? What is its value?
Yeah. So, and just a little context, what they're talking about is we go back to threats here. I have the ability to apply different standards, right? PCI DSS 4.0, AWS Foundations Benchmark Level 1. What these are is on top of our countermeasures, we actually have tags that are called standards. And if we kind of zoom out for a second, right, think about PCI DSS 4.0, I've got a list of requirements and those things are functionally telling me, hey, requirement 1, you need to do these things for firewall security. So effectively what they're doing is they're telling me when something is required. Now, when IriusRisk publishes our library content, we start everything off in a recommended status, and I'll show you what that looks like. So we see recommended on here because our goal is not to tell you necessarily you need to do this. That's where we're going to rely on industry best practices, or we're going to require, internally on your team, you guys are going to say, yes, that's a priority for us. That needs to be required. And that's where the standard comes in, because the standard allows us, and I'll go ahead and say apply all recommended here. It's going to change the state of 28 countermeasures from recommended to required. So it's effectively going to take all of these countermeasures that I had over here before that were just recommended, and now it's going to move them into required status, which demonstrates that I have a plan. I'm now going to work on that, and that's a part of my process. So it's a part of my process to go through it, and then now I have to implement those.
Sure thing. Okay, so another one here, kind of jumping around a bit because these vary, but you sort of covered this earlier, but how can I add different types of assets or labels to data flows and components? So, I mean, you did show data flows at the start, so perhaps you could focus on the components.
Yeah, so when we talk about assets, right, this does have a bit of a different meaning to different users. So when we talk about asset, I'm not talking about I have a system, I have an API. When I talk about assets, we're talking about the underlying data which is being protected. So if I click on my AWS app stream here and I right click, and let me scoot my cup out of the way here. If I go to complete questionnaire, you'll notice I have an asset questionnaire in here, which lets me say what kind of asset is being stored on this particular component. And I can differentiate, is it being stored? Is it being processed by that component? Is it being sent? Is it being received? We'll take credit card data, for example. We'll say it's, what is this, AWS app stream? We'll just go ahead and click all 4 on here, right? Then I can say done, which now by providing an asset on that component, it starts to contextualize how important and what kind of prioritization should the threats be on this particular asset, right? Because if I've got some public facing server and that server has all public data on it, right? It's just data that can be found out on the internet. Should I prioritize the threats against that particular server versus another server that's also public facing that contains PII for customers or PII for clients? Well, absolutely not, right? So it lets us provide better context between two different components or two different parts of an application where I want to prioritize this one over another one. So we've added that asset to our component. And I think we saw this earlier, but just to close the loop, we can also go in and then we can add those same assets available that we saw previously. I can add that now to my data flow so that I can show, credit card data and customer data are being moved with this particular data flow, right? And then I can follow that around if I want and complete these other questionnaires. Now, by default, and I think we'll see this here. So credit card data, so stored, processed, sent from component, and received, right? Done. So I can continue to follow these around and provide that context. And then if I wanted, right, so specifically with cardholder data, if I wanted, I could actually start providing some scoping information where I could demonstrate which parts of my threat model are actually in scope for PCI DSS, right? So I can drag and drop this guy in here, and let's send him to the back to get my layering right here. Send backwards. To back, there we go. So, so I can visually demonstrate which part of my environment is now in scope for PCI, right? So that's kind of where we would use our asset values on the components with our questionnaires and then with data flows. Good
So
question.
would this differ? I'm just thinking whilst you were showing that there, what if there was a component that needed to be included in the overall architecture, but the responsibility didn't sit with that user or that organization? So perhaps it's a third-party tool or something. How would that be sort of placed within this, and how would it be visibly shown that that was, I suppose, out of scope, but you still need to be aware that it's there?
Yeah, well, and you could definitely do that. So like I use out of scope judiciously, because I think part of the good threat model, right, is making sure that I know when something is in my environment and when something isn't. So even though I know that I have customer data coming from, this component, obviously this isn't really a great component for this, but I'm demonstrating that I have it coming into my environment where I'm now
Gotcha.
responsible for it. But my teams can see that it's effectively out of scope. And then if I wanted to, I could go back to my threat model, AWS AppStream. I could go back to my threat model, and then I could just go remove the threats from AWS AppStream. I could move those to not applicable and say, vendor responsible environments.
Should have picked a shorter word there.
Yeah, no, I should have just said out of scope. And then I can say not applicable on there, and then it's going to remove those from my threat model.
Perfect.
Right. So, yeah, and then if I want to see those, I can go up and see hide NA threats. That way, if I want to view, where do I have things that may be touching my threat model, but I'm not directly responsible for.
Yeah, I guess that's useful if someone wanted maybe more of like a supply chain level view where there are several moving parts. And as you showed, data may be being brought in, but we're not sharing something back. So thank you for that. Right, what's next? The next one is, how can I view my status with regard to a certain compliance standard?
Yeah. So I think we had PCI DSS was one we used earlier. Let me find my mouse for a second there. So if I select countermeasures, now I want to go look at the, let's call this the how well are we doing, right? Are we doing a good job? Have we effectively threat modeled something with respect to PCI DSS? So I'll give this a second to load. I updated my threat model at the same time, so I'm creating some problems for myself here. But if I go up and select this compliance standard view, I have the ability to view all of the the countermeasures on my project through a compliance lens. So if I grab the PCI DSS 4.0 standard, for example, it's going to generate kind of like a pipeline here where I can actually see how many of these are considered not applicable, and I can just collapse that down. I can see how many are required for PCI DSS, right? And then as I go through and work these, and I don't think any of these have been worked. So let's say I'm working on this, I'm going to move this to an implemented status and say save. Now it's going to move from the required state And you can see that now it's going to be in this implemented state. And then if I want to move something all the way up, I'll go ahead and grab this and let's move this to implemented. Then let's move the test status to, it's been tested, it's been implemented, and it's been verified. Now I'll see that move all the way into the top status. So over time, as you work on this threat model, and obviously this is just kind of a dummy threat model, so the data is not great. But as you work on these, you'll see them progress from it's non-compliant, then it becomes required, and then it becomes implemented. And then now, finally, it's implemented, and I've tested it to ensure that it's been implemented successfully. So this lets me go through and see that. Now, another area we do have is our report inside of here. So if I go in and generate a compliance report, I can say create that report. I can select the same standard, PCI DSS 4.0. Give it just a second to generate that report.
Yeah, you predicted my next question, didn't you? So I was going to ask, the next one here is about reporting and dashboards. So nicely done.
I got lucky on that one. No, there's a couple places to view that information. So let's give it just a second to finish generating that report. While it's doing that, so you said the question was around dashboards was next?
Yeah, so someone said, do you have any dashboards available? And then someone else has said, what reporting do you get in community?
Oh, perfect. Well, yeah, so the report just finished. Let me just download that for a second. And while it's downloading, I'll talk about the other reports. So the other reports we have are the current risk summary, the technical threat report, technical countermeasure, and then the compliance report, which we're going to look at in just a second. Each of these take a slightly different view of the information you have on your threat model. So for example, they're each one looking per component, but they look at per status of threat. So like, for example, the current threat report looks at, and we'll just download this and take a look at it for our next item, current risk. All right. So let's open up the compliance report. So on the previous screen, we looked at our countermeasures and it was showing us how they were, like how many were implemented, how many were, verified. So this report right here is looking at PCI DSS requirement 1.3.1. It's showing me that I have 3 countermeasures that are applicable to this standard that are in a required status. I have 3 here applicable to 1.3.2 that are in the required status. So I think if I scroll down, I will eventually find the one that was, here it is, implemented and verified. So I can see the one that we just did has now moved into this implemented status. And then I can see the one now is in a verified status. Now, if I open up the current risk summary report, you can see similar structure going into the report, right? I've got my name of my report. I've got a very general description, and this is based on the one we did, last month. So it's an older report, but I can see that I've got my current risk segmented by component, right? And then I can click in and it will show me what's my threat, what's my inherent risk, what's the status, is it exposed, meaning it's an active risk, or has it been accepted? What's the control available? What's the status? Is it a recommended control status, or is it an implemented? Is it required? What's the residual risk? What's the projected risk? And then I can go into the technical threat report, which again, very similar in structure, but it's looking at unmitigated threats, not applicable threats. And if I had any that were fully mitigated, I would have it, at the top of my report, but then it's breaking it down by component. So each one of our reports kind of looks at, the type of threat or the type of countermeasure. So if it's implemented or if it's partly implemented, and then it breaks it down by component so you can segment it out. So that's the reporting that's available. And I think the other part of your question was, what kind of dashboards do we have available?
Yes.
Within each project, you have a quick project dashboard, which shows you a copy of your diagram, shows you your threat risk distribution. So I can see, for example, my inherent risk on this one is 77.93%. I see my current risk is 73%. So you see we've done some work here between where we started, where I currently am. And this is probably from implementing those, I think, 2 or 3 countermeasures we have. And then I have my projected risk. And this would be if I were to implement all of the countermeasures that are currently in a required state. So from here, we have our number of threats. You can see I have 8 that are critical. I have 6 that are high, 1 that's very low. I have my countermeasure states, and then I have my weakness test results. Now, this is our project dashboard, and it's going to be unique for each project you work on. Outside of this interface, we also have our total dashboard, and this won't have as much information on it because, inside of the community edition, you're limited to working on one project at a time. But inside of here, it will show you, what's the overall risk of all your threat models. And this is a little more valuable for an enterprise customer who, maybe has 200 threat models in here. You can see the top 10 countermeasures with highest impact, which standards you're working with, projects with highest risk, which, right now is the only project I have. What's my countermeasure state? How many countermeasures have been implemented? So you can see the effectiveness of your program. And then I have my portfolio view, which looks specifically at the countermeasures and risks that have been assigned to you directly. So you see, I've got my project, my components, my threats. These are all assigned to me. So this is, the total tenant, and this is looking at just items that are assigned to me as a threat modeler in the application. So, but good question.
So if so I suppose the difference with enterprise is because you can have, as many threat models as you want, essentially, that this would be useful because if there were multiple teams, then if someone from the security team goes in, they can go to their portfolio and see all of the associated threats for them and their remit, and the same for developers and so on. And then you can push that into Jira, can't you, and other issue trackers when you're in the enterprise edition, just to help with managing workload and priorities, isn't it?
Yeah, correct. So, it just gives you better visibility into, what everything's being worked on, what's the status, are people actually working on their threat models? Because the last thing you want to do is just you threat model once, and then you never touch it again, right? It's not terribly useful. So
Yeah, for sure. Okay, right. Next question on here. Does the product allow for creating templates of threat models? If so, how are those applied?
Yeah, good question. So if I go back to my project, this is the project I'm working on here. I can convert this into a template. So new template from project, and this will allow me to build a template from this interface. So it's going to take whatever state my project was in. So if I worked 50% of it, I can then go through and create a template from this particular item. So I'll go ahead and say create template. And now it's going to let me go in and build a template from this project. This does take a second because it's going through and it's looking at all that data and it's replicating it. So I'll give this just a second to complete here. But effectively, like use cases for templates. So if I'm going in and I'm building a project, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete this project here for a second, so we can go through and build one from a template. So
Good idea.
Yeah. So I'll go in and say new project. We'll go ahead and say template testing. I'll say create project. And then once I'm inside of the project, I can go in and apply a template from the IriusRisk menu. So I'm on the diagram tab. Give that a second to load. And then if I click the IriusRisk dropdown, I'll have the ability to go into my template picker where I can then apply a template to my project. So go into import template. And then now you can see we've got a ton of templates in here. And by the way, any other template that was contributed by a community member would also be available in here. So we've got some AWS templates. We've got some GCP templates. So like if I want to deploy this GCP Cloud Armor template, for example, I can select import and it's going to bring in this architecture for me. So give that just a second. So it's going to go through and it's going to replicate my diagram. It's going to replicate all of the threats, the status of those threats, everything that was done previously, like what we had on our project. But now I could bring that in. excuse me, I can bring that in to my project as a good starting point. So give this just a second.
Are there any
Good.
limits on the number of templates somebody could create, or actually also can they import any themselves, or would the community user just have to do that themselves within IriusRisk, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't think, and I'm not sure about the ability to import a template into community. We can check on that here in just a second. I know I have the
wasn't sure.
ability to build a template and I can recreate. So for example, like here's GCP Cloud Armor. It's rebuilt this entire item from a template. So I can go into threats and I'll have, you know, all of my threats in here related to this. Right. And this is all just built from a community template that another user contributed to. So
Yeah, that's great. Saves time.
yeah, absolutely it does. Now, as far as how many templates can you have, you can see these are template created. So if we exit out of this and we go into templates, you'll be able to see that from inside of here, I can create new templates. I also have the ability to import a template. So if you had an outside template, you could bring that in as a template, and then you could create a project and apply that. But you can see from this interface, I can only see the template that I've created. Right. But from the template picker, you can pull in the rest of the community's templates, because it's not going to let you go in and edit someone else's template, but you can benefit from their work. So there's differences there.
Great, very useful, especially for, I know that some people that use community previously maybe did some whiteboarding, and then there's others that literally community is the first touch they've had for threat modeling. So definitely take a look at those templates if you haven't seen them already, to see if there's something similar to what you try to build.
Yeah, and you could even create just new templates from here, and there isn't a restriction on how many templates you can create. So if you want to go through and create multiple versions of these templates, you have the ability to do that. So you know, very much leverage this platform to, you know, make your threat modeling a little more streamlined.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
And nicely, actually, can I export a copy of my diagram? We'll answer that one now.
Yeah. So if we go into our project, and we'll just go back into the project we have two different ways to export projects. If you just want a copy of your diagram, we have our artifacts down here on the left-hand side, right? And this artifact is just a PNG of my diagram, right? So if we just grab that real quick, you can see that it's a PNG of my diagram. I can actually use this to rebuild my diagram as well. If I drag and drop that onto my diagram, so I'm just going to download it again so that it's just handy for me down here. If I go back over to my diagram, and let's just go ahead and delete this real quick and show you what this rebuild would look like. So delete everything. I can actually drag and drop that back onto my canvas, and it's going to rebuild that entire application for me. So that's one way you can save a copy of this architecture. Now, what this doesn't include would be things like your questionnaires. So you can see I've got my questionnaire down here. It's not going to save an answer to your questionnaire. So if you're using a lot of this information in here, you know, that architect, you know, restore is just, you know, it's just going to give you your architecture. Now, the other method is and I have to update the threat model to get to this, but if I go back to my main interface and I want to export my threat model, give that just a second to catch up with me. I do have the ability to delete that. I also have the ability to export that data directly from IriusRisk, and it's going to wait till it's done updating. It won't let me export until then. But if I wanted to save a local copy of it, I would have that ability. Good question.
Yeah, a good one. Well, I've just got a couple left now, actually. So why do you assign assets to different components?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we talked about that a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
It
the
was really
how,
about,
didn't we?
Yeah,
but
it
not
was
the why.
really about like the context, right? So, and like if we go back in and just to kind of visually demonstrate this again, if I want to make sure that as teams are working downstream from me, I want to make sure they know which of these is more important to work on, right? So if I've got two components in my diagram and one, remember, has that public information, the other one has some kind of
Sure.
restricted private customer data, it adds more context to my diagram. So I know which of those components, which set of threats, which set of countermeasures should be prioritized, one versus the other. So I think that would be, I think, my why of why I would, why I would add those to that. Obviously, there are going to be some compliance requirements where we have to label the types of assets we work with, but even then, that still provides us with better context.
Sure, maybe some industry specific needs, things like that.
Yeah.
I think we covered also in the April session about custom components as well. If there was the need, if there was something missing, that is possible too. And then I've saved this until the end, but basically what is the core difference between community and enterprise?
Yeah.
So maybe we talk a bit about the features, other differences.
Yeah. So, the community edition does, we call it Enterprise Lite, our community edition, but it's going to limit you to, one threat model. You can still manage templates. Once you bring in the enterprise version, really everything you have in here is customizable. So if you want to have your own custom components that are referencing content from your own custom libraries, and those libraries, by the way, could be some industry requirements, they could be an internal set of requirements, some internal standard that you want to report against. All of those things can then be brought into IriusRisk, and we can create threat models around using your custom content. Now, with community, we don't let people, build these libraries inside, because you can imagine that you could easily break someone else's threat model if they're unaware of what you're working on. We also include the ability to add, your own custom ruling. So, for example, anytime I put a component like this inside of the GCP platform environment, I could make it so that some countermeasures are already being implemented because of some overarching set of technical preventative controls that are already in place inside my environment. So all of those things could be already being done, based on my rule set and based on all of the different functionality, that's available inside Enterprise. And then we add in things like custom fields. We add in the ability to, run additional reporting. We have through the analytics module, which is another product that we have. It's like a business intelligence platform that sits on top of your database. So they're both feature rich, but it's a little different use case, most of the time. So a good question.
Thank you very much. And I mean, there are 7,500-ish community users now, so it would just get a bit messy, wouldn't it, if collaboration was available for everyone.
You'd have a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So,
For sure.
Some people with competing opinions on the rules engine. So we don't make that available in the community. As you can imagine, that could get a bit messy.
Just a bit. So we've got no more questions. No others have come in. So it's very punctual of us with a couple of minutes left. Thank you very much for joining us today, and look out for the next one in June. If you are receiving the IriusRisk emails, then of course we'll send you the details for the next session. And just a final FYI that also from June onwards, we'll be doing an AMA for our enterprise edition. So if you were interested to find out a little bit more, like what you're talking about, James, of the additional features and capability, then you can ask and find out additional detail in that. So info to follow soon. Thank you, James, very much for answering many questions and being available today. And yeah, we will see you all on the next one. Thank you.
Bye, guys.